million newest in my heart cache of words. If you ever had her as a teacher, you would receive on your birthday a small birthday card, and copied on these little pieces of tablet paper, she would copy 3 or 4 points and put them in there. And yours wouldn't be like your brother's or your neighbor's or anything. She selected them each for you. And we had a 1 through 8 school. You can go to kindergarten back then. They just threw you in first grade. But till you were 8th grade, left the school, you would get those cards from her. And in this book, I have a copy of one she sent my brother. I couldn't find any she sent me. And some people she sent them to until they graduated from high school. And one of my friends was in Vietnam, and he got his last birthday card from her, and he said that's when he decided he was going to live. So she was something, she was. On to more cheerful things. The new book does talk about illness. It talks about trauma in all forms, but it also shows an arc of getting through trauma and some of the things that I did. When I was diagnosed, I'd been from my mother who hadn't been dead very long. And I think maybe the stress did it. I don't know. If you know, caregiving will just suck soul out of you. And anyway, nobody in my family had ever had cancer. So I didn't know how to cancer, you know. If they'd told me my heart was going to blow up and I was going to have a stroke and all that, I'd say, well, yeah, that's what my family does. But I don't have any of that, so who knows? The only thing that I knew about it was my dear friend from college. You know, we've all got that friend who's nothing like us, and your mama really don't want you to be friends with, and I was her designated driver in life. She had cancer before I did and died of cancer before I did. That's why I was so meticulous about my checkups and things. Pocket money for Winona. She limps, leans heavy on the cane as we circle the rec room. One chemo took her jaw. Another took her ankle, not enough bone to hold the pin. Yet cancer swims through, dies down, but returns. We pass a pool table, and she swings the cane up. Banks a perfect shot to the pocket, leaves the cue ball in place to run the table. Her turbaned head tilts, and I catch the rogue in her that hustled the guys in the student union for pocket money. Her lesson, the one about thinking with the wrong head. Thinking she was just a girl. She has suckered death thus far. I held her hand 5 years ago when they gave her but a few months. Her body will go to science, but death will have to beat her hustle. Like then, I can only watch, hope death will be her mark, and time her pocket money. We had some adventures, we did. When she had her memorial service, her sister was comforted by having a memorial service at her church, and my friend was not a believer. And everybody got up to tell stories, and I told about the time that I had my car broke down in Atlanta. And I called her and I said, I can't find any of my family. She said, I'll be right there. And she was. I mean, she's that kind of person. And the minister said he was quite chastened by all the stories he heard of her generosity and kindness and heart, because that just wasn't what he was expecting to hear. Okay, this one's me. Spotlight. Under the one pink light of an ultrasound room, my day took an outlandish turn. I clutch a gel-sodden towel over my breast. The lone light becomes a spotlight, as if scripted stage direction. The doctor, young and earnest, enters, hands me a dry towel, averts his eyes. I recover. He takes my free hand, delivers bad news, a tumor. Small, at 11 o'clock, very suspicious, biopsy urgent. He walked over from the hospital late on this afternoon before Thanksgiving to spare the nurse a grim task. Scheduled and released, I huddle in my car, take stock, cancel my shopping, cancel Thanksgiving, crank up music, and drive, and drive, and drive. This was at if you're thinking, this is 2016, 2017, if you search your memory a little bit, you will hear a phrase in here that you will remember. This is called persist. One of the things that I did to renew myself and to work through my treatment and make myself feel better is I walked. I have a small piece of property in the woods, and I had a walking trail, and I would repeat that, that trail over and over. Sun-dappled, drowsy fawns sprang up at every turn of the trail last spring. The doe deposited them, always apart, in thickets, brush piles, honeysuckle warrens, collected them at day's end. I often saw them in shadows, suckled in the gloaming. My walks timed to disturb them least until they grew nimble, spooked less. Sleek muscled, wary, the woodland sprites, mothers and daughters, still appear as three, still graze in the wood's edge dawns, and open field twilights. Fall brought forth the mother wounded, shot across the shoulder, flesh ripped raw, fur pulled away, spines bared. I watched, hoped she would not succumb, yet she persisted. Spring, timid this year, finds her healed, graceful, still mother to beauty. I ponder the doe, her healing giving as a sign. Still I persist. Chemicals course through, fog my words, tear my hair from me, leave a specter's reflection. Fall wounded us all on this ridge. My breast, stitched, cancer excised, healed as the doe healed. Of the wondrous things that happened that year, I had got out to the end of my treatment. I was in radiation, and we had an eclipse. And that was a good place to watch. And so we had all of our low-tech gizmos, the cereal box viewers, and we had colanders, to shine through and all that, because it was supposed to happen while, during that period when I was taking my radiation. And the epigraph says, "We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon." Joni Mitchell. On the grassy bank beneath the med-flight pad, radiation techs, doctors, nurses, and clerical staff hold solar glasses, homemade viewers, high-tech and low. Some in scrubs, others in hospital gowns, all convened to view the eclipse. Appointed time, I go, beam treated, rejoin the group. The next patient wipes tears on her gown sleeve as they help her walk. I'll come back, light dims, trees cast slivered shadows, cardboard viewers show a tiny image of a giant sun. A colander throws 100 moon-eaten suns to the pavement. temperature drops, light silvers and winks out. We gasp as one, a pause in the world. Thank you. I asked my doctor, I said, do you think I'll get superpowers if I'm getting radiation during an eclipse? And he said, every woman in here has superpowers. And I liked him even better then. I often see him at poetry readings, so I figure any radiation oncologist that's into poetry, you know, you gotta like. Got my book marked, but there was a lot of things that when you're laying hooked up to that IV and they're giving you lots of strange medicines, and you lie and think about things, you know, they're in your chair. And this is a kind of a dream I had. This is about my youth. On nights, the right night around here in the mountains, if the weather was right, you could get WOWO out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And there were a couple of others that you get, but WOWO is what we got. Whoa, whoa. 11:90 a.m. You'd be disappointed nowadays. Night music. I roll down windows and fly through honeysuckle nights. Radio replays my youth. Nights whoa-whoa came through after midnight. Oldies, a comfort of a well-worn quilt. Breakups, meltdowns, high school drama. Dances that sent us into crisp autumn, sweat soap, long hair, damp curtains. Songs that had dance names morphed into protest as my senior year rolled round. I dreamed of escape to college. The decade turned. Motown, acid rock, protest, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, a rough world. Classmates called to war. We thought not to survive the Cuban Missile Crisis. Seed for hippies that seized any day that might be their last. I drive on past drowsy cows, wary of bounding deer. Stop at mountain overlook under a blackberry sky to watch stars herded across the dark heaven. Hercules treads on Draco, littlest dipper overhead. The lyre of heaven strums across the night. One of the many people that I enjoyed meeting and working with here at Heinemann was Morris Manning. And I had the classic case of chemo brain. If you don't know what that is, in destroying the bad cells, all that chemo can destroy good cells. And you have real brain fog. You can't remember things. You can't remember what you walked into the room for. I couldn't read. I couldn't even listen to books on tape. And that was probably the worst part of my cancer to me, is I was cut off from words. And somebody told me, they said, keep a journal because you won't remember all this stuff. And I thought, how in the world could you not remember this? Yeah. And it took me 3 years to open that journal. And sure enough, I didn't remember 70% of the things there. And there's a long poem in the middle of this book. It's in sections. That is my journal. These are the things that, of course, you can't, read that. But I remember Morris sent me his newest book at the time was One Man's Dark. And I found out I could make it through poems. I couldn't go any farther, but I could get through poems. And that's when I started reapprehending my language. And the epigraph is, I waved my hand over the patch but made no shadow in that place. Morris Manning. It's called Follow. The chemo clouds enveils thought. A stream hits a rock dam, splashes, diffused, lost but to weeds and mud. A reader cannot read. Follow the course of thought through a chapter, the flow of an essay, the journey of an article. The poem saves. Its brevity runs thought to a stop, grasped, apprehended. Reread, underline, pause, image clear. Word echo provokes, the thought hovers, takes form. Step by step, poems like creek stones or tree-blazed marks bring one through the forest, tangled and bare to tangled and green after a lost winter. Underline words, a pocket of found treasure, proof of the trail and guide. I suppose all poets, too, started out as nosy children, did we not? Listening to things we should not be listening to, hearing things we should not hear. And there was an old couple that lived up the holler from my granny. And I'd heard stories about him being quite the catbird when he was young. And I couldn't imagine it. Of course, I was a kid, and he was maybe 80 then. And this little wizened fella, and I thought, And then I heard the story of how his wife took care of him. Now, the rest of it I might, extrapolated, on through the years, but the first part's him. This is called Domestic Arts. When Pap started to roam, family legend goes, Ma'am, my mama's mama, sawed nearly through the metal braces under his galluses. His shoestrings the same, only a scant stitch basted on his sleeves and buttons. After a nip of shine, Pap cut loose a buck and wing, flew apart on the dance floor. Near naked, buttons bounded to every corner, became a local legend. He never mentioned it, neither did she. Ma'am trained Mama in the domestic arts. She hacked apart Daddy's leisure suit, basted that polyester nightmare top and bottom, unscrewed the acrylic platform shoe heels that once held live goldfish and replaced them with cockroaches. First time he hustled some honey, he molted. Buttons flew, disco ball glinting off sweaty chest and chains, his split pants open to the world. He never mentioned it. Neither did she. Stay close, beloved. I inherited Ma'am's sewing box, handed down by a family of women big on tradition.
Hey, y'all. So whenever Melissa asked me to introduce Willie, I said yes. I'm pretty sure I said yas with like 3 exclamation points. I love Willie so much, and I'm sure anyone who's talked to him does. And there's, his achievements are many. I wanted to point out especially Gay Poems for Red States, his book that came out about a year ago. Won the Stonewall Award, which is fantastic, and on a personal level, being queer and Appalachian, it's one of the few books that I just cried from beginning to end, even the happy ones, just because to see myself in that. And just a quick personal anecdote, and then I'll pass it over to Willie. But his name got brought up in conversation. And this was last week with another Appalachian person, and we were just kind of talking about authors we love and things like that. And she said, whenever I read gay poems for Red States, it made me realize that I could write about that I was allowed to, and that I could tell my story. And I think that's maybe the highest accolade that a writer can have. So without further ado, Willie.
I'm a little tall. First, thank y'all so much. If I start naming names, I'll forget somebody, so I'm just going to say thank you to every single one of y'all and tell you why this means so much to me, to be standing up here. Because a year ago, I came for a day visit. And by that time, I had already spoken in Manhattan. I had already read in Austin, in Cincinnati. I had spoken before Congress. And yet when I pulled up right out here, I saw a bunch of people sitting in rocking chairs. And my heart dropped. And I fled around the building and took off. And I actually had a little bit of a panic attack and cried because I don't really care what people in New York think about me. But I know the feeling of being rejected by my own people, and I was terrified to be here. And so I kind of cried and drove and called a friend who talked me down and talked me up and got me to come back. And I found that I was parked in the McDonald's I worked at when I was 17. Because I think, one, I was hungry. And two, I instinctively went to the last place where I felt like I had something to contribute that people noticed here. And I came back and walked up to the porch, and Amy Richardson looked at me and said, "Oh, I've been wanting to meet you." And that sentiment was the rest of that entire time that I was here, which ended up being 3 days with 1 day's worth of clothes. So, so I say that to say thank you all for having that same, extending that same feeling to me, that you wanted me to be here. And in all my weirdness. So I'm going to start with a weird one. This is called Sleeping with the Mothman. And Sleeping with the Mothman in a Motel 6 in Parkersburg, West Virginia. It took 2 key swipes to get in. The door to the Motel 6, the first time I slept with the Mothman, I stumbled, tipsy and giggly, past the windows nailed shut and door dented by the drunk and angry fists of now long sober or long dead men. And he was already in the room, fiddling with the remote, red eyes floating like burning giant cigars. And I didn't have to speak a word because he already knew I was drinking to forget the things. He lifted out his wings and the air swam with starless electric dreams. I relaxed into him, and red wine eye glow purred revelations across the dusty drywall ceiling and puckering of cigarette burned comforters until the future started melting down the interstate, running east to west and east to west, and the cars and the people in them waited and hoped for their exits. Thank y'all. We'll go straight from the Mothman to my Mamaw, because they're both cryptids. Or at least they both have magical powers and know the future. This one's called You Kids Be Quiet. Oh, by the way, my titles are always very extravagantly literary. Before my Mamaw said to hush, and we might just hear the stars, I had never known. The holy whisper rolling in, a chorus of 1,000 baritones, yellow pricks of light ripping the skin off the sky, tearing it from hill to hill, its fresh wound trilling down in drenching bursts of buzzing life, calling up chords of lightning bugs, harmonies slipping and drunken flits, echoing between the trailer and the creek, drawn west in the husky undertow of the dense rumble of the darkness. Thank y'all. There's a book on the top seller list right now. I ain't gonna say the name, but I've decided that I might want to read some poems dedicated to some Appalachians who deserve some dignity on the page. So this one's first published in Salvation South, and it's called Boys Saved from This. Not every Southern boy with his back held hard by a preacher, slipping him under a mud-streaked creek, wishing those waters might just wash away his still, tight, clinging daydreams of buck-naked men flickering like distant flesh fires, holding beer cans in his mind's cold night, muffled preaching, rushing, and familiar ambling waves against his face now flooding by icy baptismal wetness, and in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, while his family flings singing voices at the wheeling clouds, makes it. But I did. And now, transparent Sunday mimosa flutes flatten the fat of my bottom lip, a table-garnished sprig of friends with degrees, dill and rosemary sewn casseroles. And now, everything hovers like cellophane surfaces over the grammarless echoes of hushed boys who sanctified dance floors, twisting pulsing bodies into Madonna and Britney, but never danced to Gaga. Heard their truth on Sabbaths or New Deconstruction or DEI, who never even had the chance to cut out their blonde highlights or finally quit smoking. Boys who are no more. In the early morning, when time is still wet and wavering to and fro, I can remember the hope that glitter brings, the light of music knocking down church walls, and I can see them made new and washed clean by sound waves that soften on their way across the cosmos. Thank you. And those people over at Salvation South are great. You should be writing to them. Yeah, clap for Salvation South. Thank you. They also published this as, it's called To My Schoolmate and Friend, Amanda Reynolds, Who Should Be Alive. My hands were heavy. Wrappers, fountain cups, napkins from the floorboard, a pop can. When I saw you with a man on my road trip break, softly steeping in the amber broth of sunlight at the Tim Hortons off I-64 in Ashland, Kentucky. You had the same motor oil blonde screaming itself out of dark roots, your goofy smile wound up tight, an uneven leftward climb up your face, as your laughter smoothed its worry, even when it called up wrinkles. Joy flickered across my back. You had found a man who took you to donuts on a Tuesday afternoon and who knew how to find your little crooked grin. I wanted to say hello. Bumped a woodblock trash can lid, car garbage dripping downwards, when I remembered you were dead. An overdose. Your 20-year-old blonde hair now 20 years numb to growth or change, no longer coiling away from the mousy brown genetics, the strange twists of your mouth stretched into somber small-town funeral expression. I fell by accident on your powder blue casket when trying to find my mammal's service. You had the smallest room at Nelson Fraser, just one of 4 funerals on Friday night. But you know these hills have long been rich with the short-lived bodies of poor dead people. I smiled at the not you woman, nodded my head at the sunshine and donuts, at the man with coffee who listened to her, and her crooked smirk felt safe to ascend. And I prayed for them, that their talking and their coffee and their sunshine and their donuts know another 20 years of sunlight. Thank y'all. So let's read something that ain't that hard. And read some from Gay Poems for Red States. Just the other night, Jason O'Toole, who's one of Boston's poet laureates, called this the antidote, if not the opposite of, another book that I'm not going to name tonight. That's one of the nicest things I've ever heard. Like I told you, literary titles. This one's called Neck Bones. The more I know that I know very little. But I know a few things for sure. And I'd bet everything I know that no princess ever ate a neck bone. But I ate a lot of them at my Mama and Papa's house. My Mama and Papa's old wooden house was elderly before I was born. The porch slouching over into its crooked back in front of the door, the arthritic bones of the ceramic heaters cracking in the cold mornings, the uneven windows denser and heavier at the bottom because of a life of storm, snow, wind, and crying babies. I think the same thing happened to my aunts. When I spent the night there, I slept on the couch and would unfold myself from sleep at the beckon of the preaching wall of warmth that grew from the heater that my papa would fill with kerosene during mystical early morning hours that I'd only heard about from adults. My mama wore a red bandana on her head and played Ralph Stanley when she swept the carpet. And with each powerful shove of the broom, dust would swirl in the kerosene warm front, dancing in the morning sun that squeezed in through the old windows. And Mama would pick me up, still wrapped warm in my couch blankets, and deliver me to the kitchen table because she said the floor was too cold for my feet. Morning or evening, biscuits or beans, everything she made was covered in gravy or sauce because both surround everything until it becomes part of something bigger. Love is enveloping, and everyone knows that in the mountains, homemade gravy is love. Neck bones exist deep in that old knowledge. She always served them in an ancient sage-colored glass bowl that faded towards the lip like it was just too worn out for color. Paleontological proof of decades of grease, heat, steam, and soap. They splashed about in the bowl, floating on a thin horizon of grease, pearled, flattened globes of translucent liquid life that soaked into the soft white muscles of the half-drowned potatoes, bobbing between the fleshy bones. I don't know why she gave us forks. Eating neck bones meant abandon, a complete exorcism of rules and regulation. You'd have to hold them tight to get the slippery bone, then grasp the meat with your teeth, pulling slowly till you caught hold of the gristle, and then rip away. Pulling, rip away. Grease, juice, gristle, and tater falling onto everything. Sometimes you'd have to spit out tiny bones if you pulled too hard, and sometimes you get a big, satisfying bite that'd make you feel like you had vanquished a long-known foe. Eating neck bones and taters is a culinary equivalent of saying ain't and meaning it, as strong as a cuss word. They used to do altar call, and long-skirted women with wooden guitars would sing that I was good enough to talk to God just as I was. Covered in grease and bones and potatoes, prepared by somebody who carried me to the table, necessarily meant that I was loved exactly as I was and would need nothing more than hunger to take this communion. They will transition right into ain't. This is called The Power of Ain't. Few teachers tried to tell me that ain't a word, but the truth will stand when the world's on fire. As everybody's aunt always says with raised eyebrows and lowered opinions. But on the power of ain't, my papa fought against men in suits and built unions out of coal dust and hungry babies when he said that he ain't doing what men in suits thought all he was ever going to be worthy of doing. But on the power of ain't, my mama learned the mystical art of transforming nothing into good cooking, into messes of beans and taters with ham hocks that her grown sons would cry out for in prison cells because there ain't nothing that craves beauty like wanting. But on the power of ain't, I set fire to everybody who said no or even dared to get in my way. And I filled my hungry belly with their ashes and used the glow from their funeral pyres. To light a path to college diplomas written in languages I learned to talk better than them. Ain't nobody can tell me that ain't a word, because the truth is they're afraid of it. It's a word of negation and power and taken back. A single pocket knife whittled stroke of breath that can hit you. I'm having a hard time tonight. I'm really sorry. Because the truth is they're afraid of it. It's a word of negation and power and taken back. A single pocket knife whittled stroke of breath that can hit you back with a switch it made you fetch from the tree. Turn you inside out until your justice is unjust. And straight up shake the table your game is sitting on. And there ain't nothing y'all fear like hearing the holy truth pouring out of the mouth of some dumb hillbilly. Thank y'all. I think we've learned that my eyes are bad and I'm going to have to hold this book closer. I've met a lot of teachers in the past couple of days, so y'all made me think of this poem. It's called Scientist, and it's about, her name is Mrs. Donna Gray, if anyone knows her. She worked at ARH Hospital in Martin for a long time after she quit teaching. Scientist. Mrs. White told me we were all scientists, even though we were only in 4th grade. And since she brought us gifts all the way from New York, when she went there for a conference in September, just like she said she would, we all knew she was always telling the truth. And it was lucky that I was a scientist, because I tripped on the glossy ridge of a smiling dinosaur fossil, hiding its face just under the velvety onyx peat, all by itself in the field where woolen cattails gossiped and hushed over the brooding floodplain just beyond our trailer. I already knew how to use a phone book, so I slid my finger down the names that began with W until I landed on Virginia White. When she picked up, I told her we had to move fast since it was large enough to be a dinosaur skull. Well, how exciting. Bring it in. For 2 days, Mrs. Virginia White let me clean and brush the grin on that gray calcified skull. It stared at me from the dark and dented eye sockets that waited for me to tell my ossified discovery who he was. We scored poster board and metric measurements and photographed him like a scientific centerfold, laid out on an upside-down plastic tablecloth that a caterpillar eyebrowed lunch lady was willing to give me, but only this one time, young man. She planted our prehistoric Polaroids into a manila envelope that bore the address of a professor of science who worked at a university that was still in Kentucky, but was so far away I didn't know how to get there. For weeks, I learned via rock-sockle worksheets while a dinosaur watched me with one eye smirking from the classroom bookshelf, until Mrs. White shared with me a letter addressed to Mr. Willie Carver, esteemed 4th grade associate. The scientist bragged that because of the careful cleaning and pristine cranial polishing and meticulous measuring in well-delineated centimeters of my found specimen, he could ascertain almost immediately the identity of a skull belonging to a horse. He included several printed pictures of a horse in skeletal form, its neck surprising me with its serpentine stretch, its legs angular cylinders that finish flat like walking sticks, and its head, all too familiar, flat with cavernous eyes and an otherworldly foothill curved mandible that smiled because it knew things about you that it was not yet willing to tell. It would have been upsetting, but it's hard to be dejected when a scientist has taken the time to write you a letter and call you his associate. Mrs. White smiled so wide at me that her mouth pulled her skin tight around her mandible, creating an orbital path between it and her joy-pinched eyes, around the exact point where her eyeglasses rested on her nose. I asked her if she knew all along that it was a horse. What I knew all along, she said, is that you were a scientist. Thank you. Thank you. One more for you. It's called Waiting for God. And again, I want to remind us that we should be sharing the stories that show the dignity of the people of this place. And I can't think of a person who has more than my mom. I was excited and nervous to be baptized because I thought it would make me brand new, like a toy, still tied up and glued to its packaging, and also keep me from going to hell. In the 3 days until my baptism, I still had 5th grade homework. And on a Thursday evening, salted thick with dogwood and cool spring air, my mom joined me. We stretched out on the tired hood of her car under the Gregorian hum of a crackling housing project parking lot street light so that I could color in the phases of the moon with a pencil. She brought out a blanket and even let me sip some weak black coffee. You think God will wait till Sunday for the end of the world? What if he came tonight and I went to hell? She brought the cover around my shoulders, and her frayed and overworked arms anointed the bargain bin blanket with the power to embrace me. She gestured upwards. The same God that put them stars in the sky didn't do it so he could send you to hell. He holds them up for a reason. He'll wait on you. The dark sky became an aquarium of sparks and love, and every fish had a name. Those 3 days stretched into 3 decades. Despite the baptism, preachers and lawmakers and winners and losers and lovers and haters and neighbors with tongues and arms hot like red irons would over and over again hold my head underwater, hoping that the metal hiss of steam would mock me as I drowned. But with each plunge under, the darkness of the water would part, and fish made out of stardust would lay hands on me and dance in the spirit. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Annette Sanook Clapsaddle, and I have the pleasure of introducing our intrepid workshop instructor, Mr. Glenn Taylor. Now, I am not saying that Glenn is a demanding instructor, but you may have noticed that I wasn't on crutches when the workshop began. In all seriousness, I am honored to introduce Glenn and was more than happy to accept Melissa's invitation to do so. This may be because the very first time I met Glenn Taylor, within minutes, he was sharing his barbershop playlist with me. No, this was not a playlist of well-curated barbershop quartets. This was literally the playlist he made to go to the barbershop for a haircut. It didn't take long to realize that a large part of Glenn's life, personal and professional, is set to a tune. And if you have read his 4th novel, The Songs of Betty Bache, you already know this. Yes. Prior to his latest book, in a 2008 interview in the Chicago Review of Books, Taylor said, "I have reached a point in my time on this earth where I basically orchestrate my life at all times." So, I thought it fitting to provide his biographical introduction tonight in the form of a sort of playlist scavenger hunt. If you wish to play along, see how many lyrics, song titles, and otherwise musical references you can discern from the life and times of Glenn Campbell Taylor. Be warned, I have obviously taken creative liberties. Without further ado, in the wise words of, well, a ton of people actually, let's get the party started. Probably the first thing I should clear up is that some people call him the space cowboy, yeah. Some call him the gangster of love. And some people call him Maurice. Woo! because that is actually his first name. Choosing to instead go by Glenn because Maurice sounded too fancy to him as a child. True story. Glenn was born and raised on the country roads of Huntington, West Virginia. He wants people to know Huntington, West Virginia, not for its hot dog trail, which was how I knew it, but as a place of complexity and diversity, full of storytellers. Taylor was, in fact, not a poor boy from a poor family, but did have a mountain mama when she eventually moved south. His mother was a theater major and a material girl acting in local commercials. Because he was the wind beneath her wings, she, along with Glenn's father, nurtured his pursuit of the arts. Now, Papa didn't preach. In fact, Glenn's dad grew up in Matewan, West Virginia, site of the infamous Battle of Matewan, and a region ripe with the history of coal mining and activism. These stories deeply influenced Glenn's own work. In 1991, as a teenager, Mandy told me I couldn't laugh at my own jokes. Okay. Every evening about midnight, he'd slip off alone and call the same lady on a paid telephone. "It's me again, Margaret. Hello, is this Margaret?" he'd say. He and Margaret would later party like it was 1999 because it was, and they would marry. But first, once school's out for summer of his senior year of high school, Glenn decided he was leaving West Virginia. His family said, "Fancy don't let me down," and Glenn enrolled at Ohio University. Well, they say, oh yeah, life goes on, and Glenn soon realized this ain't Texas, choosing instead to pursue his MFA from Texas State in 2002, where he spent many a midnight in Austin, Texas, but luckily never ended up in an Austin prison. This is the point where I remind you, I did not get any of this information verified. Soon it was time to do the Chicago Promenade, and he and Margaret moved to Illinois, where he taught 9 years of community college, and they had their 3 children, Reese, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, and Eli, who John Denver reportedly wrote a song about. Speaking of John, Glenn and family eventually did take themselves home to West Virginia, where he now teaches in the English department at West Virginia University. Glenn's mentor, Appalachian author of Me and My Daddy Listened to Bob Marley, and Banana Pancakes, calls his latest novel brilliant and says that Taylor's tuned to a visionary frequency you've never heard or imagined. Get ready to fly. Glenn's work has appeared in such venues as the Oxford American, Tin House, and It's Electric, Boogie Woogie Woogie literature. But most importantly, Glenn is known for wanting to be like Mike while he drains buckets with the literary world's best and brightest at AWP's annual conference. Fellow author and Heinemann alum Jeremy Jones once said of Taylor's court presence, "The secret love child of Larry Bird and Chris Mullin, Glenn Taylor's mid-range game is as smooth as his beautiful bald head." Please help me welcome the baller, shot caller, maestro of mayhem, the music man himself, Mr. Glenn Taylor.
Good God. Well, that was fun. Oh, hey, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for having me. I must say I'm flummoxed. Would that be the right word after that? But mostly I'm just honored and humbled and very grateful to be here. And I thank you all for having me. My first time here was, I think, 2012, and Robert Geib introduced me, and I didn't know it could get any wackier and filled with such hilarity as that, but it just, life keeps getting stranger, which is fitting for this evening, because I am going to read from said newest book, The Songs of Betty Bache, and so I really appreciate that, Annette. I really do. It was beautiful, and I do more and more just think of everything as song. And before I wrote this book, you know, I just needed to do something different. It was my COVID book, as you hear a lot of people say. It was strange times. I was feeling unsure. But one thing I was sure of was that I didn't want to hear from the normal voice that I wrote a book in. I wanted to hear from my grandma Lena, for one. There's several voices I wanted to hear. One of them was my grandma Lena, who was from Matewan in Mingo County. An incredible person who you could listen to all day, and who basically said before every sentence, "Well, I said." She would just say, "Well, I said," and then she would say what she wanted to say. But she was gone, you know, so I kind of just had to remember. And then my Aunt Linda, my dad's middle sister, who's also gone, I wanted to hear her. She had one of the best laughs and one of the very orneriest senses of humor that you could come across. And then there were a couple of people that I wanted to hear that I hadn't known like family, and in some cases had never met. One of them, as Mary Ann Worthington knows, is always Louise McNeil. You know, and I had returned to reading The Milkweed Ladies again. If you all haven't read it, just please read it. And the other poet, and I never met Louise McNeil. The other poet I met once, and that was 1992 when I was 17 years old, when she came to Marshall University to read, and that was Lucille Clifton, who I always turn to in times of strife. And so those were basically the four voices, and I felt a little funny because I come from the school of Write What You Know, and one of my professors at Texas State was Dagoberto Gilb, who taught us solidly in that mode of Write What You Know. So I felt wrong in trying to call forth this voice of basically an old wise woman. But I asked around my sister, my oldest sister Carrie, my middle sister Lisa, and Pancake, her wife Caitlin, you know, I was like, "Do you think I could do this? Is it okay to do this?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, fuck it, just go for it." You know, and so I said, "All right, I'm gonna do it." But it got weirder from there. And so what I always tell people before I read is, if you can, just pretend it's not me up here reading with my slick bald head, but an old woman. Okay. And I also have to say that for the first time ever, I wrote from the future looking back, because I couldn't bear the times we were living in at the time almost. So I always read this little passage from the beginning that kind of gives you a primer of how to understand Betty Bache's voice, and it is this. Some called Betty Bache the Everywhen Woman. She claimed she'd lived for more than 300 years. She wrote these words down and sometimes spoke them aloud at her home place on Freon Hill in 2038. She referred to them as songs. All stories are songs, she'd always say. Better start dancing. And I decided I'm just going to read to you from the beginning of the book. Each chapter is a song, and I labored over, should I read Song of the Recidivist, Song of the Great Horned Owl? And I thought, no, I'm just going to read Song of the Mule Bird, which is the opening song of the book. And it goes like this. Bend me your ear, and I'll tell you a story about everything. There are songs you might remember and places you can see, trees and street corners and airplanes and old vehicles and creeks and roads with hairpin turns. Remember the dawn chorus through the window? The littlest birds sang loudest from the deep bosom. The worm-eating warbler trilled like a bug, and the song sparrow sang, "Boy, oh boy, put on the kettle." No one truthfully knows how many birds remain. Estimates on extinction rates vary, and I've got no ornithologist to query. But if you step outside and conduct your own study, I bet the hush in the trees will ring your ears. The hills are alive with the sound of truant birds, and the field is quiet as a shell. Out in the deep woods, over the course of an hour, you're liable to hear 2 or 3 bird songs, seldom more. They congregate on high and conversate. I've seen them plain as day through Remy's binoculars. I saw a woodpecker, 2 goldfinches, a titmouse. I've seen more little birds since the arrow. I'll tell you about the arrow another time. There was an old expression uttered on occasions of escape: the bird has flown. I tell my grandbabies that the birds have flown to the sun, called there by a radial core of love, and when they ask me, "Won't the birds burn alive, Big Mom?" I say, "Yes, that's right, children, and only then will the unknown gods convene their barbecue, licking their greasy fingers and picking their teeth with a snapped muskrat dick bone, raising their goblets to toast our true birth, our beginning anew." One of my most cherished pastimes is saying such things. When a child asks about a bird or a muskrat or a plane or a car, I wouldn't speak aloud that grease-licking dick bone part to my grandbabies, of course. Or if I did, I'd say muskrat baculum. If a child spots a worm-eating warbler around these parts, that child is said to be lucky. This luck lasts for some undefined short burst of time, determined by the children, and during which they all long to be near the lucky one. Luckier still is the child who spots an airplane, but it does happen. Once every couple months, an old wild-hair aviator out of Moses Town gets a prop turning on Hampton and sputters over a ridge and out of sight, and the children run with their eyes on the sky, making sounds they didn't know they could. Then they sit in a circle and argue endlessly about whether every steel drum of jet fuel got burned up or not. I tell them, "Children, don't miss the forest for the trees. There's no need for fuel when your compass is a magnet." It's been 9 years since the last of the big burns and buybacks, and domestic planes were grounded by then anyway. Avionics satellites floating dead, radio towers taken out quick as they were built. The children need to know what broke in order to build a better way. Until then, it is what it is, and you ain't getting off the ground in no iron bird no matter how many times your pilot taps the glass. There are traveling tailpackers who stop at the trading post every now and again, and they all spin the story of the bygone pilot. A couple of them call it Aviator No More. These are buskined affairs with theatrical face contortions and 2 props: headphones and aviator sunglasses. There's always a whole lot of pleading hand gestures reminiscent of a Punch and Judy show. It's a tale of old men and women who seek out the airplane graveyard and climb their stepladder and mount the cockpit, and there they sit and deliver a monologue, tapping those little invisible glass circles for hours, waiting for the needle to jump. It never jumps. That's the money line every time. It never jumps. They remove their sunglasses and wipe at trained tears. "I want to fly again," they plead. "Please, God, let me fly again." The tailpackers are spinning memories of movies. It's a tired affair. Heuchel is what the real aviators in Moses Town call their homemade fuel. It's hooch fuel. I knew an old woman who sipped it one time. I was fond of the float plane, for I once grew fat and rich and traveled to islands by float plane. And on these islands I slept in white hotels with blue dome roofs, where guest books were filled with the complaints of former guests. They wrote, "Why must the insects be so loud? Something must be done about the incessant call of the insects and the birds, who are relentless." And so something was done. The hotels had consolidated their management, and a decision was made to spray pesticides and to leave upon window sills crumbs of poisoned bread. And do you know that it worked? The islands grew silent, except for the buzz of mopeds. No matter, for the children of the wealthy traveler had grown weary of being outdoors. There was too much that was soiled and infectious. There were startling sights and sounds that may damage the sensitive children. The outdoors were so different from the call of their tablets to which they had become accustomed. Once, in the belly of a Cessna, I broke a tablet over my knee, but that is a story for another time. My littlest grandbabies weren't yet born in the time of the wealthy traveler who complained in the hotel guest book. They hear of it from the older children, and they can't imagine such a time and place. They come to me and ask for a song. I let the little ones climb my legs and get on my lap. They love to lay their heads on me, and I am happy for the wait. I tell them, the traveler could fly over an ocean in the stomach of an iron bird while their children cried or stared at a square of glass in their lap, window shade drawn while the earth rolled below, map of everything. There was jet fuel making it all happen. There were bags of crackers shaped like fish and innumerable bottles of water. The wealthy traveler ate the fish and drank the water and left the trash where they felt like leaving it. And the tired ones walked the aisle with a bag, asking for the trash. And the rich ones walked the same aisle to the tiny restroom, where they peed in a hole and pressed a button. About half of the children ask only about the screen. What was on the square of glass, Big Mom? Was it cartoon animals speaking Spanish? Was it outer space? Was it secret tunnels? This really tickles me, because I know why they ask such things, and I'll tell you. My nephew, Remy Knox, one time hooked a TV VCR unit to a solar module he'd rigged on the pole barn roof, and it ran for 3 hours before it died with the tape still stuck inside. It was a bootleg tape, the first hour and 41 minutes of 2001: A Space Odyssey, followed by Ricky Tikki Tavi, dubbed in Espanol, followed by a single episode of The Last Airbender. The children do a beautiful cover of a song from that tape. Some nights they use djembe, mandolin, and uke, some nights lute and pipa. We all breathe deep and roar on the final chorus. Secret tunnel, secret tunnel. The children will talk about that tape forever. They'll get a little older and pass down the tale of the tape to the younger ones, and it will root up and bloom, and people will speak of the glowing robot screen, of monolith and mongoose, cobra and stars, and the tale of the tape will be in the blood, inherited the way people once inherited coal and caste and ceaseless trauma. Ceaseless trauma! I have to do that there. Can't help it. It just rhymes. On Thursdays, the children trade old photographs. They call it picture swap. There's 3 or 4 boys that don't even look at the people's faces. These boys have eyes only for the vehicle in the background. Magnifying glasses are produced. It's a Cadillac, look here. Other days, they'll argue endlessly about whether or not every last bullet was really melted after the buyback in '29. Without fail, one of them always says they heard folks were making new bullets in a smelter, and that's when I tell them, children, don't miss the fire for the smoke. How are you going to hide a blast furnace? The littlest ones love the time each evening just before fireside songs, when they go off with the older ones to look for secret tunnels and pick blackbone from the crumbling high wall at Switch Rock. A coal seam runs horizontal there in one wide stripe, and they fill their buckets up with fallen chips and walk the footpath back in a line. And when they come to toss their catch in the big pit, I look at them, waiting on the fire, shoulder to shoulder with their dirty buckets, laughing, and I'm happy. Sometimes I cry because they look like the old photographs I've seen at Picture Swap, the shoulder-to-shoulder boys who always smiled when their picture was made because they'd stepped off the cage to live another day. Empty dinner bucket hooked at the elbow, carbide lamp sagged on the brow, faces black no matter their tint, pickaxe snug as a hand on the shoulder. They had coal in their blood. They had cold beer waiting and whiskey and the temporary glee of having made it back up the shaft once again. I was alive when the foreman said a mule was worth more than a man. Before that time, it was the other way around, and later it would be so again. I'm still waiting on the day when worth sees its end, the day when we can start to begin. Maybe it'll be tomorrow. I surely know it wasn't yesterday. Only thing I can remember some days is how to forget. I forget what these scars